Terrific. Thank you, Roshni. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for choosing to join us today for the second of 3 webinars on Empowering Women Leaders series, with today's focus being on he for she allies. I'm Brenda Lammy, Vice President of Professional Leadership Development at the college. We begin by respectfully acknowledging that we are hosting today from the traditional territories and ancestral lands of the Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit peoples. We invite you to take a moment to reflect on the cultural importance of these lands as we honor those who have walked before us, along with those still to come, and to reaffirming our commitment to forging culturally safe relationships on our pathway towards reconciliation. Please join me in also acknowledging the Indigenous culture of knowledge sharing that leverages collective experiences and allows people to learn from one another. It's in that spirit of mutual respect and collaboration that we come together today. As many of us are experiencing the beginning of what might be a third wave, the uncertainty of vaccinations, we would like to thank all the dedicated college members, health workers, industry partners, and leaders who are working diligently to manage and lead through the COVID-19 pandemic. It's my pleasure to invite Kelly Grimes, the Executive Director at the Canadian Health Leadership Network, to introduce today's speakers. Over to you, Kelly.
Thanks, Brenda. Thank you all. I'm Kelly Grimes. As Brenda mentioned, I'm pleased to introduce again the terrific work that Dr. Ivy Bourgault and her team have done. As mentioned in our first webinar, CHLNet has been a long-standing partner with Ivy because of her ability to turn evidence into practice, and we really appreciate this relationship. When Ivy approached us to work on the Status of Women grant, we really jumped at the opportunity. How could we say no? So if you're not familiar with Ivy, her CV is extensive, showing her compelling work for our health system, but briefly, she is University of Ottawa Chair in Gender, Diversity and the Professions and founded the Canadian Health Workforce Network, which we love, another network to work together. She is joined today by Bill Thal, CHLNet Senior Policy Advisor, who has held the helm at many of Canada's biggest health organizations. Unfortunately, Dr. Graham Dixon cannot join us today. So just to note, last year, if you're looking for a little bedtime reading, Bill and Graham released their second book on leads bringing leadership to life and health, and I highly recommend. So today we're chatting about how empowering women leaders is not only up to women. Men play an important role as allies, mentor, and sponsors. In this session, we explore the role and identify some tools for he for she allies. So a few housekeeping details before I turn it over to Ivy. As mentioned earlier, the Zoom webinar will run 1 hour in length. The presentation will be 45 minutes for the Q&A in the last 15. The link for the recording of the webinar will be sent out to all registered participants following the session. If our voices are not loud enough during the presentation, please let us know through the chat box. As our leaders are presenting, we encourage you to type your questions in the Q&A box, and they'll respond during the last 15 minutes of the webinar. You'll be able to see all the questions asked. If there's a question you really want answered, click on the thumbs up to move that question higher in the queue. So that's it for me, and I'm going to turn it over to Bill and Ivy.
Thank you so much, Kelly and Brenda. And I'm really pleased to be co-presenting with Bill on this work. Ally Toolkit for Men. So why and how men should support women's leadership in health. So we first of all ask, why a toolkit for men? And it's important to know that men have an important role, as Kelly was mentioning, to play as allies, mentors, and sponsors, supporting women and gender diverse people from different backgrounds to move into leadership roles. It's also necessary for those who occupy a position of privilege to challenge inequitable structures such as sexism, racism, and settler colonialism. And we do have our next webinar that will be teasing out some of those. But for today, just to recognize that being male is a privileged position in our gender system. And without the support of men, progress towards ending the gender leadership gap is unlikely. So I'll first of all point you that we have a number of resources on our YouTube channel, our Empowering Women Leaders in Health channel. And we have an overview video that's of just under 20 minutes that outlines the different dimensions of the gender leadership gap in Canada and some of the reasons why men need to be involved as allies. So I'll just direct you there for a little bit more information. And also just to highlight, although a lot has been made about women's leadership during the pandemic, and it is very important that many of our medical officers of health are women, and they've been doing a stellar job at leadership. In general, where many decisions are being made, there is a missing policy, a missing voice of women in policy decision-making. In this piece, we outline that there's only one female premier in Northwest Territories. The majority of ministers of health and deputy ministers of health are men. And many of these decision-making tables are not terribly transparent, so we don't know what all different representation there is there. And also highlighting that having more women at these decision-making tables would help ensure that the gendered effects of the pandemic that we are starting to see quite clearly are fully examined and are part of the recovery process. And across the board, leadership diversity and a variety of voices at the decision-making table is really important to represent the broader community. So we were already making a toolkit that we talked about a couple of weeks ago on International Women's Day, and we wanted to be as inclusive as possible. And in fact, some of our advisors had said, well, we want to know as men, how can we help? And so in a very similar approach that we took to the leads-based toolkit, the toolkit was populated with materials from a variety of sources, including both the published and gray literature, and these are all referenced or hyperlinked in the toolkit. Some of these emerged out of a systematic social media analysis on Twitter, materials that were shared there. So you'll see in the toolkit that there are a lot of tweets, which can be very impactful, or Twitter threads, for example. And as we noted before, the toolkit is accessible on the Leads Canada platform, and it is created in the Creative Commons. So you can use it to your heart's content. And we would really love to get some feedback, because we are going to be doing another refresh of it this summer. And I think they've just put a link to it in the chat. So we hope that this toolkit, the Male Ally Toolkit, will support men from all backgrounds to understand their role and the importance of their role in supporting inclusive health leadership. And that it's really a starting point for men to actively listen to and learn about how to create supportive environments for women and women from diverse backgrounds on their leadership journey. And it's important to note that leadership is not like pie, that if you get a piece and somebody doesn't get a piece, or if somebody else gets a piece, you get less. That's not how leadership is. And I'm sure Bill will be able to speak to those issues. So in the Ally Toolkit for men, we have outlined it in 3 parts. Why allyship is necessary, just to kind of give you a bit of background if you weren't convinced that it was necessary. And this is helpful information for you to create a coalition of allies. So that can be an important resource, even if you've come to this point, maybe some of your other colleagues haven't. And then what does allyship entail? And this is very much a journey. So some of the key elements that we'll go through is recognizing and unlearning biased assumptions about leadership, challenging those assumptions, biases, and issues around tokenism. And one example, we'll go into a little bit of detail around all male panels, or what are called MALs. And then Bill will really speak to the issue around mentorship and sponsorship, and really kind of highlight, the complexity of that in an era of Me Too and Time's Up, and about how to become an active bystander. So these are the elements of the toolkit. Now, also on our YouTube channel is another video, which is only 7 minutes long. And it's a video about how to be an ally and why. And it outlines some of the reasons why men need to be involved as allies. And it includes Bill and a number of other folks who are supportive of women's leadership in health. So as an example is Andre Picard, who agreed to be interviewed, a health columnist with the Globe and Mail, and he describes the gender leadership gap that he sees in healthcare. And so we have a number of these photo quotes in the toolkit. And again, sometimes those may be quite helpful for you to include in a slide deck or presentation if you want to take on this initiative. So Andre says, if you look at who works in healthcare, it's dominated by women. But as you move up the ladder, that disappears. It becomes predominantly male. And we know all the cultural and social and economic reasons for that, but it doesn't make it acceptable. And another quote in our toolkit is from another supporter, Dr. Rajani Van Aerde, who says about in the case of academic health sciences that, he found that the chances of getting a grant are lower when you are a woman. And even the chances of getting a paper accepted depends on the name you have on it. And then he pauses and says, now in academia, everything else being equal, if we want to respect ourselves as academicians, that is just not acceptable. So those are very strong quotes that really highlights, and shines the light on the importance of this issue. So another bit that we have in the toolkit, and it's very interesting that there are a number of, there's a research team at Harvard Medical School that's looking at the different ways that female physicians work. And so this is a Harvard Business Review piece reviewing a number of ththose articles published in JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine, etc., which they frame as how discrimination against female doctors hurt patients. And they really highlight that there is a growing body of evidence that's explicitly looking at that female physicians practice differently. And it's not something essential about their being female. It's in part, how they've been socialized as physicians to practice and as female physicians. And the argument in this paper is that in light of this growing body of evidence, it's reasonable to conclude that any practice bias or treatment that keeps women from entering and advancing in medicine is actually denying patients opportunities to receive higher quality care. And this was the point that I was going to be passing over to Graham, so I'll be giving a little bit of background from that. So there are important implications of the gender leadership gap for women. Women's voices aren't heard, so it's not just an equality issue. There are important implications, as the last slide mentioned. So Graham, as many of you know, is the research advisor to the Canadian Health Leadership Network. He argues it's not so that women can see themselves and know that their perspectives, their viewpoint has at least been considered in the decisions being made. That's really important. But he argues further in this quote, if you're in a patriarchal system designed in a patriarchal way and run only by men, then I would see women really losing interest in terms of being involved. And that's a huge loss of their perspective and their experiences. And Graham further went on to argue that many of the issues we face in equity, diversity, and inclusion are just in general psychological health and wellness of the people who work in these sectors in as much as it is a function of organizational design. So drawing upon some of the resources that he pulled together in a top 10 around equity, diversity, inclusion, and healthcare, he noted that dominant modes of operationalization of the bureaucratic ideal type that are intimately related to patriarchal and capitalist assumptions about the nature of work in organizations. These structural pressures are then interpreted in each organization by and through the specific cultures of that organization. And so when we talk about systemic change, the S in leads, we must also consider the design of organizations of which we are a part. And so this is really building on a couple of those key pieces. So what does, sorry, I think I might have gone, yeah, sorry, good. So what does leadership entail? Being an ally involves someone from a privileged group recognizing that privilege, actively engaged in an ongoing process of deconstructing their own privilege. I want to come back to that point in a moment. So allyship is not self-defined. Our work and our efforts must be recognized by the people we seek to ally ourselves with. So this notion of deconstruction may be an issue that's a bit of a red flag for folks. And I know Bill will speak to this issue a little bit later, but I just wanted to kind of highlight, some of Graham's initial response to the word deconstruct. And it doesn't mean to destroy or give up. The actual definition of deconstruct is to take apart or examine something in order to reveal the basis or composition, often with the intention of exposing biases, flaws, and inconsistencies. And so in his own words, he says it's really a process of learning, unlearning, and relearning, recognizing those aspects of privilege that are getting in the way of fairness, inclusion, opportunities for all, where one can alter and adjust one's perspective to remove those barriers. That's an important point. So one of those issues that one needs to deconstruct is some of our assumptions about leadership, because we've all been socialized from an early age into thinking of men as leaders, both men and women. So women have biases as well. So this image shows a typical picture of what a leader looks like drawn by a young child, where it pictures a man. And so recognizing and unlearning these biased assumptions is also important to note in a link to the text that Bill and Graham have done, is that the focus should be on leadership and not necessarily leaders. And that's the approach to defining leadership in the text. So bias does exist. According to a recent United Nations Development Program study, despite decades of progress closing the equality gap between men and women, there's close to 90% of men and women hold some sort of biased view against women, providing new clues to the invisible barriers women face in achieving equality and a potential path forward to shattering the glass ceiling. Bill also noted that corroborating these assumptions is a recent study in the Academy of Management Journal, where they revealed that getting noticed as a leader in the workplace is more difficult for women than for men, even when speaking up with similar ideas. And Bill will speak to the issue about mansplaining in a moment. So this strongly suggests that unconscious assumptions about gender affect people's ability to recognize emerging leadership. So bias exists, bias matters. And taking the following example, perhaps unsurprisingly, given the pervasive gender associations documented by researchers, academic scientists who evaluated identical resumes belonging either to John or Jennifer, perceived Jennifer as less competent. And this speaks to the quote that Johnny Van Arity notes at the beginning, the name on a publication, the name on a grant. And these names are not just around gender, but racial identity, Indigenous identity, etc. So they were less likely to offer to mentor Jennifer and were more likely to say that they would hire John to be a lab manager. They'd offer a salary that was $4,000 or 13% higher for John than for Jennifer. So bias really does matter in terms of these outcomes. Now, also in the toolkit, we have a variety of these types of visuals. We have people who enjoy reading or enjoy listening or watching a video or use visuals. So we have a lot of these. So this is one from Francesca Ramsey, 5 tips on being an ally, understanding your privilege, listen and do your homework, speak up, not over, apologize for mistakes, and ally is a verb, so it entails work and it's a process. So also in the toolkit, we have some links to tweets. And so this one speaks to the importance of listening again. Men need to continue to listen to the voices and experiences of women. We need to do a lot of soul searching and we must speak out. Men, we need you to be allies and speak out against gender-based discrimination. Don't be passive. So some more tips on how to be an ally. And although this is a bit of a busy visual, this is another sort of top 10 list adapted from Dr. Michael Sinha from the Massachusetts Medical Society. where he's highlighted some top 10 issues. I won't go through each of these in detail, but you'll see listen and learn, recognize gender differences, call out, mentor, sponsor, connect women, etc. So a number of these can be on your list of activities to support women. And understanding gender-based barriers that exist, and some of those exist at home, as is depicted in this following cartoon, that women on their leadership journey will have more barriers, and sometimes those are referred to as the glass obstacle course. But that some of these barriers are not just at home, those depicted in this visual, but they can also be at work. And this is a graphic that is in the toolkit, and I'll just read a few of them. Some biased assumptions at work. When we never hired a woman for this position before. Why are you getting emotional about this? I never thought a woman would be interested. And so these are some of the biased assumptions that one sees at work. And so now I'm going to pass over to Bill to provide his feedback.
Well, thanks very much, Ivy and Brenda and Kelly for the opportunity to participate in today's webinar and to do my part to celebrate the launch of the Ally Toolkit and to continue my journey as a recovering leader, maybe to continue to learn, to grow, and hopefully contribute now that I'm sort of in the semi-retirement authorship and allyship space. I must confess, and I said this to Ivy and Kelly just a while ago, I had two sources of discomfort here today in talking about an important issue. The first is Graham had to absent himself today, and I feel a little bit like Watson without Sherlock, or for those of you old enough to remember The Odd Couple, Oscar without Felix or Thelma without Louise. Graham and I normally do these things together and usually do a good job of getting ourselves into trouble and then having enough time for one of us to get the other one out of trouble. So my first source of discomfort is for my friend Graham, and I hope he gets his hearing attended to. The second one, more seriously, is, and Ivy already mentioned it, when we were looking at the definition of allyship and looking at, how to do that, and deconstructing white male privilege. The initial reaction was one of, holy smoke, are you asking me to kind of unwind everything, undo things? And how do you do that? So as I thought about it, and Graham and I talked about it with Ivy, it's true, you have deconstruction labs, not to blow things up, but to kind of parse out how we got to where we are and then reconstruct it in a way that's going to be better in the future. And so it's through that prism of appreciative inquiry, for lack of a better term, that I'm going to share some thoughts with you today. So still on this slide, to begin, reflections. Over many years, I've had many
mentors, coaches, and we'll talk a little bit more about sponsorship and sponsors who've helped me to better understand who I am and what it means to be a leader, and to better understand the different styles of leadership. So speaking to the women do lead differently, and I'm going to speak to that a little bit later, but I want you to think about Goleman's 6 leadership styles, right? Each of us is more or less comfortable in, control, assertive, directive leadership, coercive leadership. And I would just observe, and we make the point in the book, that women are more comfortable with some of the other leadership styles, affiliative, collaborative, coaching. And maybe we can come back to that. Many of the mentors that I've had have included women. So when I start thinking about male privileged Bill, I put myself back as a 16-year-old, 17-year-old going to the University of Manitoba, getting my BA with marks that weren't great, and applying for graduate school. And Dr. Barb Tangri, the head of the graduate selection committee, inviting me in, and I was expecting the worst. No, you've been turned down. And she started by saying, Mr. Thal, you've had a rural educational background and have probably suffered accordingly. but we do see some potential in you, and we're going to let you into graduate school. So one of my earliest mentors was Dr. Barb Tangri. Following that, Madame Bejan, what a leader. And if you haven't read her memoirs, Ladies Upstairs, you need to understand where she was a path breaker. One of the first women to be elected in the House of Commons, to the point where when she tried to go in her first day, the guards saw 3 women from Quebec coming in, say, ladies upstairs into the gallery, not realizing that they were MPs. Or more recently, Jane Philpott, what a wonderful leader and mentor to me. She taught me lots of things in working with her, not as part of her staff, but working with her. So, and of course, Ivy. That quote doesn't really come from me, just to be clear. It comes from an interview I did with Dr. Ivy Bourgeau. And it was at a smoke-filled cafe here in Ottawa, because the alarms were going off, right, Ivy? And I said, so Ivy, you're a big fan of Leads. Why? She says, oh, I love Leads. I said, but why? She said, it's had an emancipating effect for me and other women, because it allows us to lead from where we are and who we are. The fact that it talks about capabilities rather than competencies, paint by numbers management. The fact that it allows you to lead by strength, sell your strengths, be aware of your weaknesses, but authentic leadership, be who you are. Ivy will correct me if I got any of that wrong, but I just wanted to pay tribute to that, because it really did kind of set off some light bulbs for Graham and I. One of them being, in the course of writing her book, we had 5 invited chapters. One of them, by the way, excellent one, but by some Indigenous health leaders that we can talk about later, chapter 14. But we were actually going to have EDI, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusiveness, as a freestanding chapter, and we were going to invite Ivy, and I think we did invite you, and you came back with that. It's just too important to have in just one chapter. So if we look at her book, it's got these EDI text boxes scattered throughout, courtesy of Dr. Bourgeau, reminding us that in each of the LEADS, each aspect of our leadership, we need to be more conscious and aware of mansplaining, and some of the things we're going to get into in a second. The other thing I'll just mention is we feature over 35 vignettes in the book, and we didn't set out to profile women. I wish we had that as a conscious thought. We just wound up with 2/3 of those 35 vignettes being women. Why? Because they have been more able. They've done more to embrace leads. They feel more comfortable embracing leads. Another quote in the book is from Sandra Romelli at Hamilton Health Sciences Center, where she said, Bill, we live leads. We don't leave it at the office at 5 p.m. So what a wonderful, it's just, again, women do lead differently, and they value different things in their leadership. So now to the easy topic for a male. Next one, mansplaining. So there's the definition. The practice of a man explaining something to a woman in a way that shows he thinks he knows or understands more than she does. I'm not the only man who would say guilty, I hope, I expect. A patriarchal act that trains women in self-doubt and self-limitation, just as it exercises men's unsupported overconfidence. That speaks to that last slide you had. You know, why would you want to take that job? Are you really feeling up to it? Don't you have family responsibilities? Those are all ways of mansplaining why women should not, take on these jobs. Again, I went back and I looked at mansplaining. Where did it come from? And it tracks back to 2008. And Rebecca, I hope I get her last name right, Solon, an essay she wrote. Now, 2008 is when I was retiring for the first time from the Canadian Medical Association. And while the term didn't exist, I got to tell you, as I reflected back, and we're going to talk a little bit about microaggressions and mansplaining being one example of microaggressions. Just because the word didn't exist doesn't mean it didn't exist. It's just we didn't have a term for it, and we didn't have an awareness of it. And thank goodness we do have an increased awareness over the last 10, 12 years since it was first. I think it was actually voted the term of the year for like 2016. I don't know, I might have the date wrong. because it had such a profound effect on our thinking. And as I reflect back on my years as a CEO through this healthy process of deconstruction, I'm only now able to make sense out of some of the things that I should have picked up in my 360s, as an example, right? And one comes to mind. I had a wonderful woman leader who worked for me. Let's say her name was Janet. And she worked for me for 8 years. And I called her Jan all the time because other people called her Jan. And just as I'm about to leave, she said, you know, it would have been really nice if you'd have called me Janet. I signed my name, Janet. I had no idea. And you know what's worse? I had created an environment where she didn't feel comfortable telling me that, right? And so, you know, it's a tough concept for men to talk about. Can we have the next slide there? Because I found this little simple chart very profound. So the first question you ask is, did somebody ask me to talk about this? And mansplaining, I was asked to talk about it by Ivy. Do you have some relevant experience? I think so. Viewed through my lens, my perceptions and my reflections and what I'm trying to unlearn and relearn. Do I know more about this than the people on the line? People like Ivy Bourgeois? Of course not. So at some point you got to say to yourself, I'm going to stop talking now, or somebody's going to say, stop talking. I'm going to leave all of you with a question that I had. How is it that you put mansplaining on the table? How do you call us out, men, out on that without just stifling the discussion? Because I know that's how I feel when I've inadvertently, we'll talk about inadvertent conscious versus unconscious in a minute in terms of microaggressions. But how do you do that in a way that just doesn't put a kibosh on the discussion? Question for maybe the chat later. Next one, please, Ivy. Okay, so mansplaining is one example of what are called microaggressions, where you have a micro insult. That's oftentimes it's not what you say, but you know, it's, for me, my coach would tell me, Bill, every time you feel uncomfortable, you cross your arms. Or every time you're not agreeing with somebody, you're picking up your BlackBerry or you're shuffling your papers or something like that. And it's only with the benefit of the retroscope that I reflect back at on my leadership role and how I could have, I wish I had been more aware of that. And thank goodness I did get an executive coach, because I fought it initially, who could point out these factors that they call it man interruptals, or there's another term that talks about men, and I don't think this is unique to men, but men and women who interrupt people halfway through the sentence or try to complete their sentences for them, right? Another example of a microaggression, right? Micro assault, difference there, of course, being conscious versus maybe unconscious versus conscious, where it's more intentional. And it maybe involves yelling and screaming and get the hell out of my office, or not that I ever said that, but I can imagine that's where that gets escalated to. And then micro invalidation. And I must say I've experienced this, where I did have senior women around my teams all the time. But I did see, and I didn't call it out, where the woman says this, and 3 minutes later, a guy says the same thing, and everybody says, hey, that's a great idea, Jack, where Barb had mentioned it like 3 minutes ago. And so that has a tendency to quell things and to stifle, again, women coming up with good ideas. The last thing I'll mention here, and it's not anywhere in particular, is as a leader, I only learned later on that as a senior leader, if you put out the issues and put out the solutions right out of the gate, don't be surprised if people sort of nod their head and say, yeah, I agree with that's an issue, Bill, and I guess I agree with how you propose to deal with it. Listen, learn, right? Covey said, first seek to understand and then be understood. And I think it applies here. And it applies more broadly. If you're going to be a leader, then take the time to listen. Don't assume you have all the answers and then begin to explain them as if you're the font of all knowledge. Not sure that's where you wanted that to go, Ivy, but that's kind of where my thoughts. And I'm going to leave you with a question again. I kept tripping over the term microaggressions. And I'll give you an example, again, relatively recent experience. I was asked by Kelly to chair and work with Ivy and a bunch of other really good leaders and academics to chair what's called Bench 2, which is a study into leadership and are we moving the yardsticks in terms of leadership capacity in this country. And of course, we wanted to reach out and reflect the perspective of Indigenous peoples. And I made the mistake, having grown up in the prairies, thinking I knew everything about, I was surrounded by 4 reserves, that I understood the culture of Indigenous people and First Nations. And I made the mistake of referring at some point to Canada's Indigenous people. And a Métis was on the line. And did she ever give me I think it was a macro response to a microaggression. And she just kind of got quite upset. I was saying, where is this coming from? And she later explained that by the way, to explain her upsettedness, it was because I was, like so many others, using possessive. Canada owns First Nations. Canada owned, as if they didn't come way before us as settlers. But she had heard this so often that this was just a tipping point. And she later explained, and that's where Ivy stepped in and says, Bill, you have to learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And then she recommended a book that I did read. It's called Indigenous Rights with a W by Chelsea Vowell. And it has a whole chapter on Saskatchewan that I had to unlearn and then relearn what I grew up with as a culture around Indigenous people and First Nations. So the question I have coming out of this is, by calling it microaggressions, are we diminishing its importance? Are we giving a green light or a pass to men to be able to say, oh, okay, that's just another microaggression? And how many microaggressions does it take to make up a macroaggression? Is it 10, 20? Like, at what point is there a tipping point? I'd like to leave that as a question for people. Next, please, Ivy. Mentorship. Refusing on. Okay, so again, give credit where credit's due. Andre Picard, I don't know when it was, about 2 years ago or 3 years ago, he reached out to a bunch of us and sort of said, you know what, I'm tired of Manels where they've got all these white, usually white guys, pronouncing on things. I want everybody to ask the question, who else is on the panel? And if it's all males, decline. I know I did, and I know quite a few others, Graham and Johnny Benardi and others did the same thing. And I think it's now de rigueur for a lot more leaders, male leaders, to decline if it's all males. If I may, with some trepidation, say that the reverse is also shortchanging us. Having all women on a panel, again, misses that diversity. Having all white men and women on a panel misses that diversity. And it's only through that diversity of perspectives that we actually find truth, that we find better ways to deal with what we're doing. So I hope that didn't get me into trouble. Next one, please. Okay, so mentorship and sponsorship, they're not the same. Mentorship and coaching, by the way, are not the same. So the definition's there. It's a process in which more skilled or experienced persons serving as a role model, teaches, sponsors, encourages, counsels, befriends a less skilled or less experienced person for the purpose of promoting the latter's professional and or personal development. And you have 5 sort of functions or ways that you can sort of do that: teaching, sponsoring, encouraging, counseling, and befriending. Again, I'm going to share my experience with this, which is first off, the distinction between mentorship and coaching. Mentors share their experience. So I was asked, for example, the University of Alberta has a fellowship in health system improvement program that Graham and I and a couple of others served as kind of faculty. And they asked us to mentor some up and coming leaders. Well, mentorship's about listening a lot, reflecting, and then trying to relate some of your experience that might help that person deal with similar types of issues. Enforcing the fact that you need your own personal vision. You need your own personal leadership plan or learning plan. And if you're not paying enough attention to yourself, how do you hope to lead others or lead organizations? So mentoring, coaching, you never give the answer, right? When people say, well, Ivy says, Bill, as a coach, what should I do? If you answer that question as a coach, they flunk you out of coaching school, right? You ask other questions like, have you considered this? Or how did you get to where you are? Where do you want to go? You ask a series of questions. That's what executive coaches do a really good job of. And neither of those are the same as sponsorship. I think, is there another slide on sponsorship, Ivy? I think so. No, there isn't. So just sponsorship for me is going the extra mile. I'll give you an example. So instead of just pointing talented women, competent women, experienced women to a door saying, I think you should open that door. I think you should take on that job. Sponsorship is going beyond that. It's not just pointing to a door, it's helping open that door, right? And example, I get asked quite often for references. And if I think this woman leader is, or this leader is really, really good, I go the extra step of saying, you know what, I'd hire her in a minute. And if you don't, you're going to regret it. And what you're doing there is putting your own personal reputation on the line, right? And that's what you have to be prepared to do. If you really want to be an ally, if you really want to sponsor women into more senior positions, you got to do that. Last point on this is you got to get out of the way, right? I know of all too many white male privileged males who are just hanging on. They're well over my age and still taking up spots. They need to be more like my friend Andreas Lipakis. Dr. Andreas Lipakis was just until recently the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Medical Association journal that migrated the journal over to open source. You know what he did? He demoted himself. Can you imagine? He demoted himself. He's now the deputy editor and made room for the editor who is Christine, a woman. I wish more men were able to do that and had enough confidence to do that. So back to the pull push very briefly, because it does relate to what I just discussed. So it's not enough just to help people move up the ladder, women move up the ladder, or to pull them up the ladder. You've got to do more, and Dennis Kendall is right on here when he says, I can't read the full thing there. Let's see here. When stepping away from a board or senior management roles, men ought to reach out to women who may be interested in those roles, encourage them to apply, and offer to serve as their ally. What does that mean? It means, and I've been privileged to be asked by several women to help them with the interview. If I know about the organization, why wouldn't I? By the way, I'd have anybody who asks me, but you have to be particularly prepared to respond yes to the woman asking for help. Here's a question though to this one. And again, I might get myself into trouble, and Graham's not here to get me out of trouble. But in the course of offering that help to a woman to get up the ladder of leadership in the context of Me Too, how do you make sure you're not being seen, and I'm going to be very frank here, as coming on to that woman or trying to get some kind of favor? And again, it's something I think we need to be able to kind of talk about. It's uncomfortable, but I think we got to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, right, Ivy? And that's it for me. I think there's a few more slides for Ivy, but thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Bill. And so, yeah, this was perfectly placed in terms of a segue. There are elements of addressing these issues that could be uncomfortable, and so we do pull some of that. This is a colleague, Sophie Soclarides, who looked at a study. And so we have to recognize these. And I think that we just, again, listen, have these conversations out loud. There are other elements in the toolkit about being an active bystander, which we can come to in the discussion. And so these are just some of our sort of take-home messages, you know, the notion that diversity is a fact, equity is a choice, and inclusion is an action, and belonging is the outcome. And then we get better decisions because we've taken all of these different ideas and experiences in mind. Leadership diversity and decision-making may not be comfortable, but it makes for a better process and better outcomes. And so these are some of the key insights. I think we've got sort of take-home messages here. That support for diverse leaders is necessary to enable them to bring their unique experiences to the table, to make more meaningful decisions that serve diverse communities. White men have an important role to play as allies, especially those who are in additional privileged position of being settlers, cisgender, heterosexual, and not disabled. And there can be no progress if we do not challenge inequitable structures such as settler colonialism and racism, along with sexism. It's not either, but all of them at the same time. So we'll be coming back to some of those issues in our last one. So just wanted to recognize funding that we received from what was then called Status of Women Canada, now Women and Gender Equality. And thanks so much to Leeds for providing us a platform for these toolkits, because we want them to be used. Please do. And thank you so much. These are some ways that you can follow us. And I will pass this back to Kelly, who will moderate our discussion.
Thanks to you both. It was a really good overview of the toolkit, and I loved Bill's examples as always. And I have to say, Bill, you did do the push, pull, and mentoring and sponsoring me, because I definitely didn't want to be the executive director of CHLNet, but Bill pulled me and said, yes, you can do this, absolutely. And now I'm 6 years later and loving it still. So maybe to start, a few people sent questions in ahead of time. So one is about breaking patterns of male domination. Learn since childhood, suggestions for helping raise their voices to stop being interrupted, men taking credit by reframing what female colleagues have already said, and what suggestions have you, Ivy and Bill, about how to get leaders to model and support such defeating patterns? And Bill, you kind of talked about this with your presentation on mansplaining and microaggressions. So I guess the question that you raise is, how do we call out men who do this without shutting down the conversation?
Can I just give an initial crack at that, Ivy?
Yeah. Yeah.
So someone made the distinction, an important one, that we make in the book between leaders and leadership. Depending on how you pose that question, it can be either sort of what can Bill do as a leader, or what can Ivy do as a leader to help address that problem. And there are things we can do, like model the right behavior. But I would look more to at a system level, at the organizational level. There are organizations that I'm aware of. I sit until recently, I sat on the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons Board, and they had a 2-day session on what we're talking about. Awareness raising, but that's an organizational responsibility. All organizations should be embracing this toolkit like they did the psychological health in the workplace toolkit that we developed in another context. And so I think organizations need to look at themselves. We all need to look ourselves in the mirror, honestly, especially the males that are still leading organizations. But I think organizations can and ought to do more to prevent and raise awareness on the one hand, and then call it out on the other hand.
Yeah, I would just add to that an organizational response is really important. I think that at a micro level, so if you're at this meeting and there's all of this interruption happening, and we'll all have examples of that, and we've either done it or we've experienced it. And sometimes it does hurt, when someone calls it out. So when it does get called out and someone has done that, it's really important that that person be supported, right? It's just to say, and maybe you describe it, in a way that says, maybe you didn't, anticipate this reaction, or maybe you didn't think that what you've said would be interpreted as being sexist or racist. However, you can see how it can be interpreted that way. So that's like in the moment. But from an organizational perspective, trying to do something to prevent it. And I've been, in different cross-cultural ways of doing consultations. So as part of the project, one of the activities was to do an Indigenous leadership circle. And so the circle is like literally everybody gets a chance to say something. And when it comes to them, they could, pass, and I don't really have anything to add, or I just would like to echo what is being said. And there's no interruptions with that because everybody gets a chance to say things. So you can structure things in a different way.
Not to interrupt, but just to add, you remind me, one of the things I did far too late in my tenure as a CEO was to actually ask for a monitor at each one of my senior leadership team meetings. Would actually, and in this case, I like to think I was smart enough, but I did go with the senior woman on the staff and asked her to do a chronicle so that we did a little wrap up at the end, and it included, it was Bill interrupting too often. I honest to God, true. Is Bill talking too much? Is he interrupting people? And she would say, Bill, you're still doing it. So that's one concrete way that a CEO or a senior leader in an organization can actually address that. It's a way that boards also deal with it, right? We haven't talked about boards, but boards have monitors as well to ensure that you're sharing the airtime, that the potentially token voice in the back is getting enough airtime, that kind of thing.
Interesting. I hadn't heard about that. That's a good tip, Bill. So maybe this one's for you, Ivy, in the Q&A box. Suzanne asks, is there research to indicate the extent to which men are willing to act as allies and actively deconstruct the gender bias that benefits men?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Thanks so much, Suzanne, for asking that. I think that this is a bit of an undiscovered country. Like there's much of this has just been happening in the last little while. So we started a project in 2018 and we completed it at the end of 2011. And it's been hard for us to put a stop to it because there's all of this new research coming out, which is the reason why we committed some additional funds out of my research chair to do another refresh of the toolkit, and especially getting feedback from folks, and then we know what's come across Twitter, what's been published since then. And I think that there are more and more men who really want to be a part of this. I've been really pleased to see that it isn't just later career men that are interested in being allies, but mid-career and early career men. I think especially early career men find it very, very difficult to be in circumstances. And so they want tools about how to be an active bystander and call things out. And so I think that there's a lot more of that. So I'm hopeful.
Thanks, Ivy. So another question in the chat box, how do you ask for someone, especially male, to be your ally? If they agree to do so, what ways could I ever quantify that they are in fact being my ally and challenging systemic racism and unconscious bias against women who belong to BIPOC? I have addressed sexist stereotypical behaviors in the past and which has been dealt with, but there are no policies or a corporate leg to stand on in place that ensures representation of BIPOC on my organization. As a woman of color, I think it would make sense to seek allyship from Caucasian women too, wouldn't it? So Bill or Ivy, who wants to jump into that one?
I can begin. I absolutely agree. You absolutely have to have white women as allies, which is what in part the toolkit that we're going to be talking about next week. And it was inspired in part by Nell Weeman, who heads up the Indigenous Physicians Association of Canada, who said, I don't want to be your Indigenous encyclopedia, you're going to have to do the learning. So I heard that and said, I'm going to create an encyclopedia of sorts about how to be an ally. So the audience for that toolkit are white women and white men. Because the first toolkit for men is getting at issues around the gender system, and then we get around the system around anti-Black racism, colonialism, anti-disability. I think as much as possible, you need to think about, this is why I love the leads framework, because you start with yourself and then you get an ally, and then you work about making systemic change within your organization and then building it up from there. And some of it is, okay, there's going to be a controversial issue coming up at this meeting. I need you to support me. I'm going to say this and I need you to back me up. And just talking about that. And then that gets moved forward to develop a policy and a program. And it needs to be kind of laddered in that way, right? When we deconstruct, we have to construct one step at a time.
So just to add 2 quick points. One, at the individual level, we haven't mentioned the word trust and how important that is in sort of allyship and mentorship. You need to establish that trust, and there are 2 philosophies. One is, you reach out and then they earn your trust. Or as Malcolm Gladwell in his most recent book, Talking with Strangers, says, assume trust. And you won't be disappointed in 90% of the cases. So, but trust is both the glue and the grease that can help you, stay on track and grease the skids so you go forward. The second thing that popped out in the question, and thanks for the question, is the issue around policy. There need to be policies in place where you can report anonymously and immediately and constructively these issues, or they'll only get worse. So, if the company or the organization doesn't have a corporate policy against harassment that has a place to go that's secure and safe and that you can trust, then we need to work towards addressing that big hole in the organization.
Thank you, Mel. So we have about 4 minutes left, so I'm hoping to get 2 quick ones in. So one question was sent ahead of time, and maybe this is for you, Ivy. There are so many women who work in healthcare. How do you make the case that women leaders need support?
Yeah, important issue. Well, then you look at the data, which unfortunately we don't have a lot of data about women's occupancy in leadership positions as leaders. So pushing for more transparency around those data. The health workforce, over 80% women. So if you wanted to have equity, then you would have 80% women in those positions.
So true. Bill, do you want to add anything on that?
We'll leave it for the next question.
So Taryn asks, what kind of space do we have for women that have leadership styles that are perhaps considered masculine? How can we approach this when our traits are called bossy and bitchy, unlike our male counterparts? Bill, do you want to start on this one?
Whoa, that's a thanks for the question, though. I mean, it is. So earlier on, I said, talked about leadership styles and assertive and directive leadership style. It's circumstance driven, first off, right? Whether a male or a female, the type of leadership style you adopt is a function of the context in which you're leading. So in the early days of the COVID crisis, leaders were expected to step up to the plate, whether they were male or female, and be more assertive and directive. People were expecting it. We learned through the CHLNet study leading through COVID that that's migrated towards more distributive bargaining leadership positions. But the nomenclature and the judgment that goes in, the differential judgment, that's a culture thing for me. Again, that comes back to, it's the responsibility, whoever's running that organization, to call out that kind of sort of two-class system or double standard, right? Guys, assertive and directive, and the woman's, whatever words you used. That's a culture thing, and it seems to me that has to be addressed immediately, constructively, and positively by whoever's leading that organization.
Yeah, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? I mean, you want to be seen as a leader, and as soon as you act like a leader that you've been socialized into thinking, which is more masculine, then you get called out. So I think just understanding that and bringing that to light. But, when we get back to our leads-based toolkit, I think about, the quote from Dr. Gillian Kernahan is that we should lead from our authentic selves, that we shouldn't have to take on a certain persona. We should lead authentically.
Yep.
So fabulous. I'm so conscious of time. So it looks like in the QA that I think it's more of a comment than a question. So how immigrant women that are prepared to fit those leadership positions are included, how leaders are prepared to mentor and coach a woman from diverse origin. Ivy, do you have anything to add to that before?
Yeah, and we'll be speaking to that a little bit more next week, but I think it's really, really important for us to think about diversity of experience and opinion writ large. And that increases our knowledge when we're making decisions in terms of like how to to put out public safety announcements, as they do, for example, with Ottawa Public Health. So I think that that's really important. So diversity is a given. Inclusion is an act that we actually take on. And so the more that we do this, the better.
Perfect. So we're just running. I think we could have talked about this for another hour, if not more. So thank you to you both for sharing the He for She Toolkit. To all of you listening in, please share this further through your organizations, to your friends, family, whatever. Roshni has put instructions in the chat function on how to access the toolkit. But if you're off the webinar later and you're wondering, you can find instructions both on the Leads Canada and CHLNet website. As Ivy mentioned, this is part 2 of a 3-part webinar series. The next one's next Monday on diverse leadership. And lastly, a reminder, if you are a member of the college, this webinar qualifies for 1 credit of the maintenance of certification requirement. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to Bill and Ivy for this very engaging conversation. And that's it from us from Ottawa today.
Thanks, everyone.